We'll start promptly at 11:30. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Susanna McDermott, Director of Communications at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. On behalf of ICCR staff and members, we welcome you to this overview of our 2021 Proxy Resolutions and Voting Guide. ICCR's Proxy Guide is an annual compilation of shareholder resolutions filed or co-filed by ICCR members for a given proxy season. We publish the Proxy Guide and are convening this webinar to invite support for these proposals and the environmental, social, and governance concerns they raise. For those of you who may be meeting us for the first time, I just want to take 1 minute to briefly introduce ICCR. Currently celebrating our 50th year, ICCR is a coalition of over 300 institutional investors representing more than 2 trillion in assets under management, who use their collective leverage to make common cause on issues of corporate responsibility. Our guiding principle as shareholders is that sustainable corporations must look beyond the next earnings report to account for the full impact of their business on society and must view the well-being of all of their stakeholders, including workers and the communities where they operate, as integral to their long-term success. ICCR's membership comprises a wide spectrum of institutional investors, faith-based organizations, asset management firms, union pension funds, foundations, and other responsible investors. The Investor Alliance for Human Rights was launched in 2018 to grow the network and build the capacity of investors engaging on business and human rights concerns. We saw significant erosion of the regulatory frameworks meant to foster greater accountability over the past 4 years, particularly related to climate change. Yet shareholders continue to keep these and other critical issues in front of boards and management through their proposals. As you will hear from Sanford in a moment, proposed rules at the Securities and Exchange Commission and Department of Labor threaten to restrict shareholders' rights and access to the proxy. For these reasons, investor support for these proposals is critically important. It is our hope that this brief overview of our proxy guide will catalyze discussions around ways we can collaborate on issues of common concern, including the protection of shareholder rights. Finally, we are mindful that we don't do this work alone and want to recognize here the significant contributions and support of our allies and partners, many of whom are on this call. Just a few housekeeping points before we begin. You will be in listen-only mode throughout the webinar. We have reserved the last 15 minutes for a Q&A, and our speakers will be on the line to answer your questions. Due to the large number of participants, we are asking that you submit your questions through the question box, not the chat box. You should have at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to submit these questions as they come up during the course of the webinar, as opposed to waiting until the very end in order to get your questions in the queue. When typing in your question, please tell us 3 things: your name, organization, and which speaker the question is directed to, if you know. Whatever we can't get to on the call today, we promise to follow up on afterwards via email. I also want to remind everyone that this webinar is open to the public, it's being recorded, and with us today are members of the press. So let's get started. We'll turn first to Sanford Lewis, Director of the Shareholder Rights Group, to provide an update of the current landscape at the SEC and to give us an idea of what we might expect going forward. Then my colleague Julie Wackety will take us through the highlights of this year's proxy guide. Afterwards, we'll hear directly from ICCR members about key campaigns this year. So on to Sanford Lewis, Director of the Shareholder Rights Group, an association of investors formed in 2016 to defend share owners' rights to engage with public companies on governance and long-term value creation. Sanford.
Thank you, Susanna. I'm deeply honored at this opportunity to start this ICCR overview of the upcoming proxy season. At first, I have to admit, I was puzzled. The powerful work of ICCR speaks for itself. So why start with a focus on shareholder rights? But when I looked at ICCR's proxy book for today's conversation, it all became clear. More than half of the anticipated proxy proposals are marked pending. Pending, which means pending an outcome of an engagement, or just as likely a decision in Washington by the Securities and Exchange Commission. As many of you know, companies can challenge shareholder proposals at the SEC. Informal decisions by SEC staff called the no action process largely determine whether a proposal submitted to an Exxon or a Goldman Sachs on climate change or racial equity will live or die, appear on the proxy, or be excluded. So everyone is asking, with the big changes happening in Washington, how will that affect the SEC and shareholder proposals? So my task here is to read the tea leaves. Along with many other things that took a beating over the last 4 years, shareholder rights also suffered. There were 2 rulemakings at the SEC and 2 more at the Department of Labor. In particular, the combination of SEC shareholder proposal rule changes and Department of Labor rules on proxy voting came across as pushback against the growing power of ESG and mission-driven investors. Aside from those new rules, the informal no action process also suffered in individual rulings and new staff guidance. Shareholder proposals suggesting a particular outcome, such as setting greenhouse gas targets or aligning with the Paris Agreement, were excluded as micromanagement, overturning decades of similar proposals. And new substantial implementation exclusions allowed generalized company reporting to override the intentions of proposals and proponents, even when the company actions obscured rather than delivered climate accountability, for example. So does the Biden presidency, with its focus on climate change, COVID, economic recovery, and racial justice, bode well for shareholder proposals? Well, one thing that we can say is that the new SEC leadership changes are simply phenomenal. With Allison Lee as acting chair, Sachin Khanna spearheading climate change, John Coates as acting director of corporation finance, and Gary Gensler nominated as chair, these are positive developments for shareholder rights and ESG. But will these changes affect those pending proposals for 2021? It's still early. Lots of important proposals are wending their way through the SEC process, but there are some tea leaves to read. On Tuesday of this week, an unwritten SEC determination allowed exclusion of a proposal asking Moody's for routine equal employment opportunity disclosure based on the ordinary business rule. Proponents' lawyers speculate that the proposal's 60-day deadline for EEO disclosure was the problem. But with no written ruling from the SEC staff that says that, the unwritten decision opens a can of worms on future challenges. More tea leaves. The staff did not exclude a proposal at Valero linking executive compensation to climate change, rejecting the company's substantial implementation challenge. And a decision at Kohl's and 2 other companies allowed ordinary business exclusion of a proposal to extend COVID-era sick leave policies after COVID ends. Many more decisions are eagerly awaited by proponents, but optimism about the new leadership is tempered by the sense that problematic ideas of the last 4 years may have staying power. So as we listen to today's presentations on shareholder power exercised through the proxy, we need to recognize that shareholder power also comes through investor organizations, ICCR and the other umbrella groups, and their future efforts, whether through lobbying, petitions, litigation, or legislation, to restore shareholder rights and to advance ESG investing. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much, Sanford. Okay, and now we'll move on to my colleague, Julie Wackety, ICCR's Deputy Director of Communications and the principal author of the Proxy Guide, to provide an overview of this year's guide. Take it away, Julie.
Thank you. Good morning. ICCR began annually publishing the Proxy Resolutions and Voting Guide in 1974, just a few years after our inception. The guide contains the full texts of ICCR member-sponsored resolutions, both as lead and co-filer for 2021 corporate proxies as of February 21st. These resolutions are also available on our website, iccr.org, under the 2021 Resolutions tab. If you are an investor, we invite you to read these proposals and vote your proxies in support of those that you can. A link to download the guide will be sent to you following today's webinar. So I'll take us through some key trends from this year's guide. ICCR members have filed 244 resolutions at 152 companies. There are a number of noteworthy trends. Rising racial justice concerns are reshaping investor priorities. Diversity and racial justice have been key engagement issues since ICCR's founding. This past year, spurred by the Black Lives Matter movement, they have grown to be the largest category of resolutions at 64, increasing 50% over 2020. In June of 2020, a broad coalition of investors had committed themselves to addressing systemic racism. Thus, many of this year's resolutions take direct aim at workplace policies that reinforce racism in company culture and throughout society. This year's filings reflect also the far-reaching impact of COVID. Altogether, 44 resolutions address the pandemic's widespread, long-lasting impacts across multiple sectors, through calls to prohibit price gouging on vaccines and for the implementation of paid sick leave as a standard U.S. employee benefit. While some companies provided temporary PSL for employees at the height of the pandemic, many companies in low-wage sectors have not adopted permanent PSL policies to adequately protect their workers, an area of much concern for investors. There were additional mentions of the pandemic's impacts in inclusiveness, governance, and lobbying resolutions. Amazon, of course, is also once again the target of multiple shareholder resolutions for its ESG failures. Amazon's unrivaled global impact has grown explosively during the pandemic, further increasing its multiple ESG risks. ICCR members filed 9 proposals at Amazon, more than they sent to any other company this year, and matching the number they sent it last year. The proposals call for a civil rights and diversity audit, enhanced customer due diligence, action on hate speech, and more. Amazon is seeking to block 6 of these from its proxy. New strategies have also emerged to confront the climate crisis. In the wake of the US's rejoining of the Paris Climate Accord and GM's announcement of an ambitious plan to sell only zero emissions vehicles by 2035, corporate lobbying against climate-forward legislation now appears both backwards and fraught with risk. New resolutions are asking companies to evaluate whether their lobbying activities align with the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. Another new resolution asks companies to provide shareholders with the opportunity for an advisory vote on the company's climate policies. And the January Capitol attack dramatically underscored risks in the tech sector and corporate political spending. Social media companies have come under widespread and well-deserved criticisms for their failure to adequately manage and stop the spread of online hate speech, disinformation, conspiracy theories, and incitement of violent extremism, including racist violence. More broadly, the tech sector faces a difficult future in which it must navigate a path between support of a free and open society and active facilitation of hate speech and violence. 20 resolutions were sent to companies in the tech sector this year. And on the heels of the January 6th attack, many companies took the unprecedented step of temporarily halting their political spending. 10 resolutions tackle corporate political spending this year. So broadly speaking, where did investor interest coalesce this year? Here we see a breakdown of filings by issue. At 64 proposals, resolutions addressing racial justice and diversity are the most numerous this year. Climate-related proposals are the second most active category at 54, and proposals addressing human rights and worker rights are the third largest group with 37. Next comes corporate lobbying disclosure and political contributions with 25, and governance with 23. Environmental health, sustainability, and water saw 19, health 13, and food 9. There were a number of new topics this year. These include access to COVID-19 products, companies' policies reinforcing racism, paid sick leave, and shareholder advisory votes on climate change, and still others. When shareholders file a resolution, companies may reach out to the filers and request a dialogue to discuss aspects of the proposal. If an agreement between both parties is reached that satisfies the main requests of the proposal, filers may choose to voluntarily withdraw the resolution. Every year, ICCR members negotiate roughly 100 of these agreements. At the time of publishing, ICCR members had withdrawn 42 resolutions. We expect that number to grow in the next few months and to be consistent with the 114 we saw in 2020. Members successfully negotiated agreements at Core Civic on racial equity audit, at Entergy on Paris-aligned climate lobbying, at Disney on oversight of workplace equity issues, at Gilead Sciences on access to COVID products, and at Sanderson Farms on human rights due diligence. Later this year, we will issue a report on all agreements negotiated by our members in our publication, Catalyzing Corporate Change. Emboldened by the new SEC rulings Sanford mentioned earlier, ICCR members are seeing a sharp increase in no action requests. To date, 62 resolutions have been challenged by companies or being adjudicated at the SEC versus 25 at this time last year. The issue areas seeing the most challenges are diversity and racial justice and human rights. Spurred by the Black Lives Matter movement, in June, a coalition of investors committed to addressing systemic racism through their portfolios, company engagements, and policy advocacy. This has in turn led to a number of innovative resolutions. While earlier investor strategies frequently called for corporations to release workforce diversity reports as a way to increase the representation of women and people of color on corporate boards and in senior management, many of this year's resolutions are going a step further by taking aim directly at workplace policies that reinforce racism. Meredith Benton will discuss these proposals later in our webinar. The country has lost some momentum over the past 4 years in the fight against the climate crisis, and the new administration is rightfully laser-focused on redressing this. Accordingly, the climate-focused resolutions were the second most active area, filing at 54, up from 35 last year. These resolutions show that investors are more concerned than ever about the substantial material risk that the climate crisis poses for their companies and their portfolios, and they are seeking clear and consistent disclosures regarding how companies are managing and mitigating that risk. Rob 4 will discuss this year's resolutions addressing Paris-aligned climate lobbying momentarily. Since our coalition's inception, ICCR members have worked with companies to eradicate human rights abuses in their operations and global supply chains. Human rights-related filings were the third most active category among our members, with a total of 37 proposals. These resolutions highlight a myriad of workplace and human rights issues, including the urgent need for paid sick leave for frontline workers, the dangers of hate speech and surveillance, risks to freedom of expression, protections for whistleblowers, conflict zones, forced labor, and more. In a moment, you'll hear from Blanca Agustin about this year's group of paid sick leave proposals. ICCR's members have also engaged corporations on their political contributions since our coalition's earliest days. This year, our members saw 10 resolutions on political spending. Investors also remain concerned about the lack of transparency and proper oversight regarding direct and indirect corporate lobbying expenditures, as they pose a multitude of reputational, legal, and business risks. Racial equity emerged as a new theme in lobbying resolutions filed at Best Buy and also Walmart. In addition, a returning GEO Group resolution emphasized immigration and private prisons. Investor work on lobbying disclosure is spearheaded by AFSCME and Boston Trust Walden, while investor work on political spending is coordinated by the Center for Political Accountability. Sound corporate governance structures serve as the bedrock for healthy long-term financial performance, creating value for all stakeholders. Our members filed 23 corporate governance resolutions. Half of these emphasize the importance of independent board chairs. This year also saw 3 resolutions calling for worker pay to be taken into consideration when setting executive compensation. Several resolutions called for hourly associates or other non-management employees to serve on boards of directors. Investors have also long argued that properly managing environmental impacts helps companies compete in a business environment marked by growing public rejection of overuse and waste of precious natural resources. As the plastic pollution crisis has worsened, shareholders have begun calling for reductions in plastics use as well as strengthened recycling initiatives, a concern underscored by a dozen resolutions this year. This year, the dominant healthcare story is, of course, the COVID pandemic. Altogether, 44 resolutions address its far-reaching, long-lasting impacts, both directly through calls to prohibit price gouging on vaccines and indirectly via mentions in governance, lobbying, and inclusiveness resolutions. In a moment, you'll hear more about this year's COVID medicine affordability resolutions from Christopher Cox. ICCR's members are also continuing their ongoing campaigns to rein in high drug prices and to address the impacts of the opioid crisis. The opioid work is coordinated through the Investors for Opioid and Pharmaceutical Accountability. ICCR members also filed 3 tobacco resolutions. ICCR's members engage with food companies and call on them to better manage their adverse impacts and to ensure that our food system is safely and sustainably producing our food. Food resolutions typically call for reductions in deforestation, food waste, pesticides, and the use of medically important antibiotics in animal agriculture. Recently, investors have begun to address food equity, i.e. the intersection of health, nutrition, and racial justice by questioning brands on their role in perpetuating racial disparities in our food system. And now we'll move on to our guest speakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Julie. We will now hear from Blanca Agustin from United for Respect, who will talk about resolutions filed at multiple companies on paid sick leave as a standard employee benefit. Blanca?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'll be speaking about the importance of addressing gaps in paid sick leave policies, and will highlight the paid leave proposal filed this proxy season at Walmart. The COVID-19 pandemic has renewed public attention to the importance of paid sick leave in safeguarding public and worker health and promoting economic stability for working families. For low-wage earners in public-facing sectors with heightened risk of exposure to COVID-19, like retail or food service, paid sick leave could prevent infections, outbreaks, and store closures. Yet, large segments of our essential workforce are unable to follow the simplest of CDC guidelines. If you feel sick, stay home, because too many low-wage Latinx and Black workers simply don't have access to paid sick leave. Policymakers have long recognized the benefits of paid sick leave. 14 states and 38 municipalities have enacted paid sick leave laws and ordinances. The Families First Coronavirus Response Act required employers to provide paid sick leave for workers ill with COVID-19 or caring for a sick family member, but large corporations like Walmart and McDonald's were exempt. Investors, workers, and other stakeholders have ramped up efforts to address the paid sick leave crisis at some of the largest corporations in the country. Proposals were filed at 7 companies this year, including McDonald's, Yum Brands, CVS, Kohl's, Dollar General, Kroger, and Walmart. All of the proposals call on the corporations to study how to adopt or enhance existing paid sick leave policies. I am happy to report that as you sow, the filer of the Dollar General paid leave proposal withdrew it after the company agreed to waive fees on telehealth through the next annual review period. The remaining 6 companies submitted no action requests to the SEC. And despite the urgent need to provide paid leave to essential workers, the SEC sided with 4 of the 6 companies. The filers of the Walmart and Kroger proposals are still awaiting a determination from the SEC. United for Respect, along with BMO Global Asset Management, Daughters of Charity, School Sisters of Notre Dame Cooperative Investment Fund, and Praxis Mutual Funds, co-filed the resolution at Walmart because the company's standard and COVID-19 emergency paid leave policies are too complicated and difficult for associates to accrue and take needed time off without penalty, jeopardizing both worker and public health. According to a recent UC Berkeley study and New York Times editorial, approximately 350,000 Walmart workers fail to utilize or have no access to paid leave whatsoever. And in a May 2020 survey, 45% of Walmart workers reported that they are likely to come to work even if they feel sick. The primary reason they gave was fear of being penalized by management via points, loss of hours, or other disciplinary action. In June of 2020, a coalition of 12 state attorneys general wrote to Walmart asking them to adopt a paid sick leave policy that provides the minimum protections required under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Paid sick leave policies can mitigate the negative impact of the pandemic, especially for low-wage, female and non-white workers who have borne the brunt of job loss. Paid leave also benefits companies. Studies have correlated paid leave with improved morale, lower turnover, and higher productivity. This proxy season, investors can help ensure workers and companies realize these benefits. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Bianca. And next we'll hear from Chris Cox of Seventh Generation Interfaith Coalition for Responsible Investment to talk about a group of proposals at pharma companies on the access and affordability of COVID medicines. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Susanna. And good morning, everyone. It's a privilege to share with you about the Health Equity Group's pharma resolutions. The pharmaceutical industry deserves praise for producing safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines so quickly. Developing a vaccine takes an average of 10 years, if it works at all. Despite years of well-funded research, there are still no vaccines for HIV or malaria. We now have multiple COVID vaccines, all developed in less than a year. These vaccines are the product of innovative research spurred by unprecedented public investment. Operation Warp Speed has provided more than $10 billion in support of vaccine makers for the development and expansion of manufacturing capacity. Another $825 million has been given in support of monoclonal antibody therapies. As of a month ago, U.S. commitment to the CT accelerator stood at $6 billion. Last week, you may recall, President Biden pledged another $2 billion to the international COVAX effort. Amid such vast public investment, the same pharma companies have been pursuing monopolistic deals with the fruits of taxpayer-funded innovation, rather than volunteering to share their know-how for the next great task facing humanity, getting those vaccines to everyone, everywhere, at the lowest cost possible, as quickly as possible. Those companies then face financial risk, legal risk, and reputational risk. The most recent projection estimates a loss of $9 trillion globally if there is not an equitable distribution of vaccines. The legal risk is seen in bipartisan bills in the US House to curb monopolies and in the US Senate to develop a public database on funding. We also have seen President Biden invoke the Defense Production Act to boost vaccine production. Some executives and directors have had uncanny timing with stock sales, raising allegations of insider trading. Pharma, driven by the opioid epidemic and controversies around high drug prices, suffered from a lower reputation than even the federal government as recently as 2019. Just as one might flip a house, there are allegations of molecule flipping. The Washington Post reported that a private university developed a molecule with public funding that may be an exceptional therapeutic for COVID. Then, a new company with no laboratories and no manufacturing facility purchased the rights to it from the university. The new company then turned around and negotiated undisclosed terms with one of the pharma companies. The vaccine success has caused a rise in reputation, but that improved reputation is at risk without universal access to an affordable vaccine. Our 2021 filings then with Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, and Eli Lilly ask the board of directors to report on how public investment in vaccines and therapeutics is or will be accounted for in such things as setting prices. This is important because drugs don't work if people can't afford them. An increasing number of signs, the rise of coronavirus variants, and our collective failure to mask up and maintain social distance suggests that COVID-19 will become an endemic condition much like the flu. Billions of us likely will need the vaccine each year. This is not an issue that only depends on governments. Corporations have an important role to play in ensuring equitable access to affordable quality care. This resolution ask pharma companies to account for their role in our collective fight against the coronavirus. Thank you for your attention, and I'd welcome any questions about this issue.
Super. Thanks so much, Chris. And now we'll move to Meredith Benton of Whistle Stop Capital about proposals seeking to evaluate diversity initiatives and action on racial inequities. Whistle Stop helps asset owners and advisors assess and address material, social, and environmental issues within their investment holdings. Meredith.
Thank you, Susanna. So in conversations earlier this year, a to-remain nameless company commented that it recognized it was time to release its consolidated EEO-1 form, the best practice standard around workforce composition. When we then asked the company to release its data related to recruitment, retention, and promotion rates of its employees, it demurely declined. After all, it explained to us, its EEO-1 looks okay. Its recruitment efforts are very strong, but retention is a big problem for them. Once diverse employees join, they don't want to stay. In 2021's proxies, Whistle Stop supported the filing of 20 resolutions asking companies' boards to report on their assessment of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, including the release of goals, metrics, and trends related to their promotion, recruitment, and retention of diverse employees. Filers include Nia Impact Capital, As You Sow, and the Nathan Cummings Foundation. We also work closely with As You Sow, providing the research for a benchmarking of the S&P 500. Within the S&P 500, at least 19% of companies now share gender recruitment rates. For gender retention rates, it's 11%. Race and ethnicity disclosure is lower, but there is transparency leadership in key industries. For example, promotion and recruitment data is shared by Con Ed, Goldman Sachs, Progressive, Twitter, and Walmart. Promotion and retention data provide essential insights into understanding a company's true practices. Do female and non-white employees have opportunities to move up while reaching true pay equity? Do diverse employees stay at the company? In our corporate conversations, we've seen concerning disconnects in the way corporate disclosure is created. There are companies that have made very strong statements around their racial justice commitments, but they are unwilling to share with us the data that's associated with their own employees. As You Sow has done incredible work in benchmarking S&P 500 for a separate initiative, its Racial Justice Initiative. There they looked at 18 indicators. And in addition to the disclosure of data, the data set that I already talked about, they're looking at if a company releases a racial justice statement, where the statement was posted, if the CEO has taken personal responsibility, if Black employees participated, if the victims of race violence have been named, if the company explicitly states that Black Lives Matter, if they call for criminal justice reform, name systemic racisms, and identify as anti-racist, among other indicators. Both of those databases are going to be made public on March 4th by As You Sow. All of this is searchable by sector, by market cap, by employee headcount, and by region. So we have a strong sense of which companies are leading and which companies might need a little bit more encouragement. As You Sow also filed 4 resolutions asking companies to simply disclose their plan for promoting racial justice. The ball is currently in the court of the companies. They were willing to make strong statements on their commitments to racial equity. It's great, but it's now time for investors to ensure that those commitments become something meaningful, that they make a difference in the opportunities presented and in the lived experience of marginalized and underrepresented employees. Thank you.
Great information. Thanks so much, Meredith. And finally, Rob Four of the Presbyterian Church USA will tell us about a group of proposals requesting that companies align their lobbying activities with the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Rob?
Thank you, and it's good to be with you all. I'll be highlighting the 7 filed shareholder proposals included in ICCR's new climate lobbying initiative. Overall, ICCR members have been requesting climate lobbying engagements with 25 companies representing multiple sectors seen as critical to combating climate change. A wide range of investors, including faith and values-based investors, mutual funds, unions, foundations, and public pension funds, recognize that climate risk is a material issue for their portfolios. There is growing discussion at the federal, state, and local levels, including the very significant September 2020 report by the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, warning that climate change poses serious emerging risks to the US financial system and calling for regulators to move urgently and decisively to confront them. As a result, investors are increasingly asking their portfolio companies to be more transparent about how they align their direct and indirect lobbying activities with the goal of limiting average global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, consistent with the Paris Agreement. Investors want to know if Paris-aligned companies' climate policy is a top policy priority for our portfolio companies. Do companies have a process in place to evaluate whether their trade and other associations align their public policy priorities with the Paris goals? Do they even align with the company's own stated goals and principles? Do company boards have governance processes in place to effectively oversee instances where company lobbying doesn't align with the company's publicly stated climate goals and principles? We already know that such misalignments pose detrimental financial and reputational risks for our portfolio companies. US companies currently stand in sharp contrast to many European companies on climate lobbying. BP, Royal Dutch Shell, and Equinor have standalone climate lobbying reports that largely serve as examples for US companies. Along with Total, these companies have an evolving set of principles to evaluate and act upon their trade association memberships and the climate lobbying positions of these associations. These companies have clearly committed to supporting the Paris Agreement goals, as well as carbon pricing as an appropriate climate policy measure. Like many other ESG practices that have started outside the US and soon arrived at our doorstep, we see that climate lobbying practices are already spreading to our country. We expect to see expanded policies and disclosures in the coming months and years. In 2018, the Responsible Investment Committee of the Presbyterian Church USA engaged in an effort to implement a directive from its General Assembly that encouraged a church-wide effort to address environmental justice issues, especially as they relate to the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation disproportionately experienced by vulnerable communities, often communities of color. This led the Responsible Committee investment members to seek out opportunities to do direct engagement with affected communities. Facilitated by local Presbyterians with long-term relationships, committee members were able to meet with representatives of affected communities in South Louisiana during 2019. The goal of these engagements was to listen, learn, and be led by these communities, and to discern if and how their concerns could be incorporated into the church's shareholder advocacy work. A common thread emerged from these conversations. State legislators are a primary barrier to addressing the issues for the communities, and these legislators are often funded and or influenced by corporate interests, which can exacerbate barriers to progress. Led by these experiences, the Presbyterian Church USA has taken a leadership role in the ICCR Climate Lobbying Initiative. We submitted 2 climate lobbying shareholder proposals, including one in Entergy, a utility based in South Louisiana. We've engaged companies to align their direct and indirect lobbying with the Paris Agreement goals and their internal monitoring processes, including their board's oversight role. After engaging Entergy over several months, we agreed to withdraw our proposal in return for expanded climate lobbying disclosure in their next sustainability report, expected later this year. They are also considering a standalone climate lobbying report, as was requested in our proposal. And they're looking at examples that we have sent to and continue to discuss with them for best practices. As a result of our engagement, they're also looking more closely at how their board committee oversight of public policy and trade association actually works in practice. We reached a similar withdrawal agreement with AIG. In addition, AIG's chair of its board's nominating governance committee engaged us on these issues so that we were assured that our climate lobbying concerns are being heard at the highest corporate levels. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Super, thanks so much, Rob. And I want to thank all our speakers who did an outstanding job. So we're going to move now to the Q&A. I want to remind everyone, it looks like you're doing so now. Some people were posting their questions in the chat, but if you could just move them over to the Q&A so they're all in one place, that would be super helpful. Again, as you're posting your questions, just tell us who you are, your organization, and which speaker we should direct the question to if there is a particular speaker. So let's start. We have the first question from Dennis Sadowski, Catholic News Service. How has the pandemic influenced the issues being considered for proxy votes? and anyone can answer. I think some of that may have been answered by the speakers already, but Chris, maybe you want to take that one since it's right with the pharma company.
It certainly starts with the question around getting those vaccines to everyone, everywhere, as quickly as possible at the lowest cost possible. That's certainly at the heart of it, and with an awareness of all the spending. But I think it also really factors into, for instance, the paid sick leave resolutions. And I think more generally, if I were to kind of step back, I would say that COVID-19 actually kind of underscores the priority of a lot of resolutions that we've filed over years that look at some of the most vulnerable folks in the economy. Maybe I'll leave it at that and see if somebody else wants to jump in and add to that.
Anyone else have a comment, or should we move on? We have a lot of questions, so I think I'm going to move on. But I think a lot of that was covered and is covered in the book as well. But any further questions on that, Dennis, you know where to find me. Okay, Bruce Wiggins asked a question, Julie, about the banking the bomb resolution. If you know a little bit about it, you can tell Bruce really briefly. But Bruce, also that the resolution will be featured in the book, which is you'll get the link within an hour or two, so you can read it yourself. But Jules.
Sure, thank you. So the banking the bomb resolution was essentially a human rights due diligence proposal, I believe, filed at PNC. And that was a filing that was coordinated by Investor Advocates for Social Justice. And it focused on its financing of nuclear weapons. So you'll be able to read the text of the resolution in the book, but that is in essence what they were getting at.
Thanks. Oh, wait, we have a question here, I think from Meredith. Eric Darasaw. Are ICCR members, including African-American experts and organizations, in corporate racial equity dialogues and practicing inclusion?
Great, thanks. So, and Eric and I have been talking, and he's been really kind with me and helping inform me on the long history of ICCR's work on this issue, including initiatives in the late 1990s that he participated in. It's also a great time for me to mention that there are a large number of ICCR members involved in some way across a range of initiatives, including Zevin, Investor Advocates for Social Justice, Trillium, et cetera. I can speak to what the initiative, the Racial Justice Initiative, As You Sow, which has an advisory board made up of sort of leading members in their own right, in their own community, and it's a very diverse group that is helping to guide the work that is being done.
Great, thanks, Meredith. We have another question for Chris from Frank Sherman. Are any pharma companies considered ethical relative to public funding for COVID therapies?
Trying to be delicate about how to respond to that, but it would seem AstraZeneca probably has exhibited the better practice, but I don't know that we would say that any of them were necessarily best practices. They made some of the strongest commitments about pricing and collaboration internationally. There's still more we'd love to see from them, but you know, measuring them across that would probably be where I'd put that emphasis.
Chris, while you're with us, hang on for a second. Another question from Laura Weiss at CQ Roll Call on the pharma proposals. What did Regeneron and Gilead agree to that led to withdrawals?
Yeah, so Gilead, basically their agreement was they publicly stated that, yes, we received public funding, and no, we didn't factor it into pricing, which is disappointing to us, of course, but it fulfilled the ask of the resolution. So it made sense to withdraw. And Regeneron acknowledged receipt of public funding and access in low middle income countries. And so at least, you know, again, that fulfills the ask of the resolution. And yeah, maybe I'll hold it for the time being.
Great, thanks. This one for Sanford. On behalf of Sisters of St. Dominic SRI Committee, I think I'm gonna pitch this one to you, Sanford. Can you share strategies for crafting resolutions that will survive scrutiny by the SEC? the big question.
Well, it's hard because they've basically, over the last 4 years, they've kind of created a narrower needle into which to get a proposal through. And so we talk about threading the needle between micromanagement, don't be too specific, and substantial implementation. Oh, well, we already did the vague thing that you asked for in the proposal. So it's a problem, and unfortunately, it's the kind of thing that it's good to work with a lawyer on. It's hard to give you more general advice than that. Certainly be familiar with the rules, and also be familiar with what the company's already done. Those are fundamentals, I would say.
Stay on, Stanford, because I think we have a series of questions that are all sort of related. From Alice Donaselv, Intentional Endowments: what actions are being taken by investors to engage with the SEC on understanding their no action responses and encouraging greater acceptance of proposals?
Yeah. ICCR and the Shareholder Rights Group wrote to Allison Lee shortly after she was appointed as acting chair to ask her to particularly look at climate change related proposals in the no action process. And we attached a little report on that. And we've also, the Shareholder Rights Group has written to John Coates with a set of suggestions, but that's just the start. I think a lot of the dialogue is going to come probably after the season. Every year there's an annual stakeholder meeting where many of the shareholders meet with the SEC and talk about what happened in the season. And so I think it's an ongoing process, and shareholders very seldom will get any further clarification than whenever the SEC has written or not written on the determination. So that's why I talk about tea leaves, because it really is, unfortunately, a pretty obtuse process in a lot of ways.
Another question, Sanford, from Judy Byron. Do you have any handle on the numbers for written SEC decisions versus unwritten?
Yeah, and background on that: until the last year or so, the SEC used to give a written ruling on each determination and give some kind of clue as to why the decision came out the way it did. They stopped in November 2019. They announced a new policy that they've been implementing of not issuing written decisions, and mostly they're not issuing written decisions. They did issue a written decision on that Coles determination, and I'm going to put in the chat for everybody right now that written decision, which was unusual in the level of detail that was involved. So everybody, panelists and attendees, can read that decision that I just put in the chat that shows, and it was unusual in the detail, even from prior years, and that was the theory of issuing fewer decisions, was that they were supposed to give more guidance. And I would say that they gave guidance, even though we don't necessarily like the outcome on that one. And we probably, most of us in the ICCR group, might disagree with that determination.
Thanks, Sanford. Question for Rob from Frank Sherman. I understand that ICCR members are engaging companies outside the oil and gas sector on climate lobbying. What is the objective for these companies?
Thanks for that question, Frank. So in the 25 target companies, the companies represent multiple sectors that are seen as critical to combating climate change. So and the particular companies do not have adequate disclosure on their direct or indirect climate lobbying. So the objective is similar for them to do an analysis of their trade associations and whether they are aligned or misaligned with their own policies, and if there's misalignment, what are they doing to mitigate it? So it's very similar to the oil and gas.
Thanks, Rob. Chris, this is for you from Alan Jilka. You mentioned efforts to lean on pharma companies that have received large amounts of federal dollars to enter into agreements for voluntary disclosure of how they have spent these federal monies, as well as their plans for equitable distribution of vaccines. Regeneron and Pfizer have the 2 vaccines currently in distribution. What time frame do you envision for these reports And is headway being made getting Pfizer to enter into an agreement, as Regeneron has already done per your presentation?
Yeah, I don't believe that we'll be able to enter into agreement with Pfizer, but I might be speaking out of turn on that. So I'll wait and maybe just say don't know for sure. But in terms of the kinds of things that we'd hope for, that would be the kind of best practices, and this kind of hits at the question also regarding AstraZeneca before, and the kinds of things we'd like to see from the companies. I mean, we'd like them to publish a global access plan for its products. We'd like them to publish their R&D costs, publish its profit margin, publish the average and or marginal costs of production, publish the production capacity, the subsidies it's received, the text of the licensing agreements, and committing to kind of a responsible licensing mechanism, so that many of the agreements actually have been by Pfizer and some of the others are bilateral. And we really want to see more that goes into the kind of international sorts of agreements to make sure that other countries, low and middle income countries especially, have access. Time frame on the reports, ordinarily these resolutions would ask for it within a year. Our resolution actually, I don't think it has a specification within of a time frame on it. And yes, Pfizer and being one of the distributors, but Johnson & Johnson also very soon will have one available, and so we'd be expecting reports from them about their vaccine. I think that captures a fair amount of the question. But I think maybe one other piece is we want the company to be more proactive around access planning. That prioritizing countries with the highest disease burden during the registration internationally of these products, developing equitable pricing schemes so that low-income countries can access it at a better price than, for instance, a country like the United States. Again, those voluntary licensing arrangements, and strengthening the supply chains to ensure that all populations around the globe gain fair access.
Great. I think you answered Meg's question, which was, can you explain what companies are responsible for in terms of access? In other words,
that was in the back of my mind, even as I was addressing kind of the kinds of things we'd like to see in these reports. Yeah.
It's not just about price, right?
No, it's around a whole host of things. The price is kind of one of those places where the rubber hits the road on the question, but those underlying issues are actually fundamental.
Great. Tim Smith would like us to just remind investors that are not ICCR members that on the climate lobbying proposals, that it's not just ICCR members that are filing these proposals, that they're working in a coordinated fashion with other groups, namely Ceres, and a group of European investors as well, that I believe are led by, I want to say the Church of England, but Rob, you might be able to correct me if I'm wrong on that. So that is very much a sort of a meaning to present a very united front on that work. Let's see, other questions. I think we're sort of getting to the end of the questions here. Mary Jane McQuillan has said, I have to admit that I'm surprised to see CVS listed among the companies. Would you be able to share more details? And are you speaking, I think Mary Jane might be talking about healthcare coverage topic.
Right. Well, she has a follow-up around their D&I, so I'll start on that, assuming that one's for me. We're in a very, very, very active conversations with them right now. We're at the stage where we're talking multiple times a day, and it would be a great time to have any investor interested in greater disclosure from them to shoot a quick note to any relationship they have to say this is something they're looking for. CVS they're one of these fascinating companies. They made a phenomenal statement. They made a $600 million commitment around catalyzing change as related to racial equity. And we're really hoping to encourage them to release more on their workforce composition, to release their promotion rates of their diverse employees, their retention, their recruitment of the same. They are like many other companies where this isn't something they've put out before, and they're not entirely sure how it's going to be received. And there is no perfect company out there, right? And what we're looking at is a systemic problem, right? No one company is creating the problem. No one company can solve it, but we need to have significant increases in corporate disclosure in order to understand where the most effective programs exist.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Marcy Merningham, who is a decades-long academic activist in this space and a longtime friend of ICCR. Question for all. How are you helping to raise awareness among place-based residents and institutional investors about the ways in which they can support these resolutions, even if they aren't owners? As taxpayers, they're stakeholders in the how well or not wealthy NGOs manage their assets. Anybody can take that.
I guess I'll take a first stab at it and say that, we're a coalition based in Milwaukee. We're regional, and we have both faith-based members and we also see part of our mission as being, as well as values-based members, we see part of our mission being educational. And so actually I've invited some people to be a part of this webinar, and we also kind of work to share these sorts of insights with others to help others become both active owners, but also to act in the other spheres where they have influence.
Susanna, I'll take a shot at that as well. So as the shareholder advocacy arm of the Presbyterian Church USA, we do our advocacy through shares held by our pension fund and our foundation related to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church. Our committee, Responsible Investment Committee, produces resources for those two entities, but also for the 1.4 or so million members of the Presbyterian Church USA who are in all 50 states and in Puerto Rico. And any Presbyterian entity that has an investment portfolio, as often congregations have endowments and other kind of judicatories have long-term investments. We provide a proxy voting guidance tool that will be that's available on our website. So, and we try to get that out when it's ahead of the kind of the voting season.
Great. Meredith, from Marcela Pinilla, can you provide an update on Fortinet? Their proposal last year garnered about 70%. Did the company follow through?
Right, so Fortinet's a NIA impact capital filing, and we've been very pleased to see, right, this is a great example of when a shareholder resolution and a high vote makes a difference. They've really stepped it up. They are actively working with an outside consultant to develop their programs, to review their programs, and then to build their transparency. So their first report is coming out this year with intentions to build it over time. It's as true as many other companies. It's a new issue for them in many ways. Right? It's a new issue for them to think about disclosing publicly. It's a little bit uncomfortable for many companies to think about sharing what feels a little bit intimate aspects of culture that needs to change over time. So we've been really pleased with how well they've sort of grabbed the reins and moved forward.
Great, thanks. This is from Graham Sinclair. I think it's for everyone. Has ICCR compared company statements on health benefits, diversity, etc., with their political lobbying and decided to make it a part of the shareholder advocacy? Who wants to jump in? Why don't we just let that one go for now, and we'll promise to get back when everybody's done some further thinking about it? Does that feel right? Okay. Well, Janet Petersworth, I think this is going to go to you, Bianca. This is about the paid sick leave policies and YUM. She said that they have been active in Louisville and is surprised that they were on the list.
Yeah, I can partially answer the question. We're not the filer, and we weren't a co-filer on that, but they were among, we did coordinate, so they were among the group of 7, and they did challenge at the SEC, and they were successful. But I'm sure ICCR has a copy of or it's probably in the book, the copy of the resolution, and so you can see it there.
Great, thank you. Okay, Eric Darasaw, again, any comments on working more closely and collaborating with African American organizations and political leadership on racial equity issues? Anything further on that?
I don't have anything further right now, but Eric, I think I can pop into the chat the advisory board members for the As You Sow Racial Justice Initiative, and then I would invite other members of the ICCR community who are working on this issue as well to reach out to you.
Great. We are at 12:30, so I'm going to just say that we're done with Q&A for now. Any other questions, please just email us and we'll make sure that we get them to all of the speakers, and then you can correspond that way. The link to download the Proxy book will be emailed as soon as we get it together in about an hour or two. We encourage everyone to please share it broadly with your constituents and networks. We want to underscore again the importance of remaining active owners of your stocks and exercising all of our rights as shareholders as we can by voting our proxies. Thank you to all of our great speakers today who did such an outstanding job, and thank everybody who was on the line today for all of your great questions and interaction. Have a wonderful day, everyone.